Welcome back, everybody. This is Eric here with Iraq Veteran 8888. Have you ever wondered how exactly do you measure black powder? Okay, I know a lot of people have probably heard, you have to measure it by volume. Some people say you have to measure it by weight. Well, what's correct? I mean, volume, weight, how do these two things correlate between each other? There's a lot of misinformation that gets spread around about black powder, and I really enjoy shooting black powder quite a bit. I really love my muskets. I love my Snyders, my Whitworth over there. I've got Martini Henrys, various 4570s. They're cartridge-contained black powder rifles. Black powder can be a lot of fun, and it's a very rewarding sport to be a part of. It does require certain discipline, and there's always that kind of age-old, tried-and-true wisdom. Oh, well, throw 70 grains of black powder by volume and put it in the case. So, wait a minute though. Wait a minute. When you buy black powder is sold by the pound. All right, if I buy this jar of powder, it says 1 pound. Right there, 16 ounces all day long, 1 pound. It doesn't say however much powder fits in this can by volume. No, it says 1 pound, which is a unit of measurement. I can measure 1 pound, and 1 pound is 1 pound. So where does this volume thing come into play? You know, it's weird. So what we did, now we took this is a standard type of powder measure that measures black powder by volume, okay? You pour the powder in here, you twist this little thing around and it kind of cuts the charge off, and then this is set to 7, which means 70 grains, and then you pour, in theory, what will be 70 grains into your cartridge or down the barrel of your gun or whatever the case may be. Is it 70 grains? Well, we did a little bit of looking around. We did some research, okay? So we took, these are the types of powders that I have available to me. This isn't all of them, but we've got some Swiss Supreme black powder. We've got some of the Stützchen German black powder. I've got some Shockey's 3F Gold, which is a black powder substitute. And we've got some Pyrodex, which is another popular substitute. So 70 grains is 70 grains, right? The issue is, okay, the exact weight is all over the place. Okay, it's not very consistent. It does throw into a sort of a weight range. Now, what we found is for the volume, and I sort of cheated here and just wrote down some data points here. What we did is we took this powder measure and we took all of these different powders and we weighed by volume 70 grains of powder. So mind you, when somebody says, oh, you just weigh it by volume and you throw it in a case and that's it, what are you really getting? Okay, because 70 grains is 70 grains. It weighs 70 grains, right? Well, what we found is that the weights were kind of all over the place a little bit. We found that with the German 2F, which is not on the table here, but this brand of powder in a 2F, our average actual weight was 71.72 grains. Okay, that was our average over a 10 throw string. Okay, our extreme spread was 4.8 grains and our standard deviation was 1.16 grains. Okay, so not very consistent. Okay, so let's look at black powder just like we looked at smokeless powder. Okay, let's say that you were throwing 70 grains of smokeless powder into a rifle cartridge to load your favorite round or whatever. I'm trying to think of what would take 70 grains of powder. Maybe a 300 Win Mag or something like that, okay? So say you were loading a 300 Win Mag, and let's say your load called for 70 grains of powder, okay? You can throw smokeless powder volumetrically, okay? You have a powder thrower, whatever, just like this thing. This is actually a powder measure that's intended specifically for black powder. We'll get to that in a moment. But bear with me here. Let's say you throw your 70 grains, and say that your powder measure was throwing this inconsistent. Would you want to load that in your cartridge? Probably not. Especially in some of these other powders when we found that the extreme spread of some of these powder ranges was as much as 6 grains. So you mean to tell me you're trying to throw 70 grains for your 300 Win Mag, and then you turn around and one of your charges weighs 76 grains? Holy crap, that's a big difference. That's dangerously different, right? So if it's not acceptable for smokeless powder, then why is it acceptable for black powder? Okay, Or the question you should ask yourself is, why does it matter, Eric? Why are we even having this conversation? All right. So what we found throughout all these tests is that for the volume that the measure was supposed to throw, that the weights, the actual weights, the average weights of the powder, in most cases actually exceeded what the volumetric measure was supposed to throw. Okay, so with the Swiss 1.5F, we threw 72.85. Wait a minute, that's supposed to be 70 grains. 72 grains. We'll get to that in a second. I promise this is good information. You need to know it. All right, with the Pyrodex Select, all right, this is a substitute, by the way, which substitutes are intended to be substituted volume for volume. So if a cartridge calls for 70 grains by volume, you throw 70 grains of the substitute. Okay, it's the same thing, it's just different composition. The average of that was 71 grains with an extreme spread of 3 and an SD of 0.95. Not overly terrible, actually, in terms of how well it threw out of the volumetric measure. But again, the actual weight is actually 71 grains, which is slightly higher than the intended 70 grains of powder. All right, now here is where this data starts to matter a bit. All right, now we get into the Gymshaki's 3F, okay? 70 grains of volume brought me to an average of 54.08 grains of actual weight. So when these people say, oh, well, you should never measure black powder by weight, you should only measure it by volume, that's only a half-true statement, because what you have to do is you have to ensure that the volume required does not exceed the actual weight of what the powder is. If that doesn't make sense, okay, let's assume that I was just going to be a smart aleck and say, well, I need 70 grains of Gymshaki's. And instead of confirming what the 70 grains of volume is in terms of weight, let's say that I were to just take this powder and just throw 70 grains of powder by weight. Guess what? With all of these, we would be okay. We'd be okay to do that. Without checking and just assuming, we'd be all right here. Here we might not. Because 70 grains by weight compared to 70 grains of volume, if you threw 70 grains by weight, you're actually getting more like 85 grains by volume. That's a problem. Now, what if that power level exceeds what your gun is designed to handle, or maybe your gun's going to shoot really erratically? Now, is it enough to blow up the gun? Probably not. But it's something to consider. Now, how do we know? Now, we'd have to test this, but how do we know that the 54 grains by weight of Gymshaki's is not the actual intended power level for what the 70 grains volume equivalent that it's throwing? Maybe the 54 grains just happens to be what it weighs, and the power level is exactly the same as 70 actual grains of powder, which we found to be very close to the intended volume for the other powders. But you have to let the devil be in the details there. You'd have to load up the 70 grains by volume, shoot it, and if the velocities are extremely low, well, then you would know that basically this is just bullcrap. It's off. You have to make adjustments for what your individual gun needs. Or let's say you shoot it and you weigh it 70 grains by volume and you're getting the precise velocity you want. Everything's good to go. All right, well, what would you do then? Could you still weigh this by weight instead of by volume? You absolutely could. So let's say that 54.08 grains gave you the exact precise velocity that you want out of this powder compared to the actual 70 grains by weight that you would get out of this, or by volume, because we found that by volume and weight, these are two very similar weights. Then, okay, you would weigh out 54.08, and that would be your actual grains weight that you would throw for the cartridge. I know it's confusing, but it's an important data point, because you can't assume that 70 grains is 70 grains without confirming the volume that they're calling for and what it weighs, and then confirming those velocities. All right, so we'll move on. Those were the substitutes, but then we got into the Swiss 2F cartridge grade, the Swiss 3F powder, and we found again the 2F cartridge grade, which is more of a scientific prill grade black powder, is super fine black powder that is very consistent kernel sizes. So it measures really well, and it pours super smooth, and it fills up a very consistent amount of volume, which gives you pretty consistent weights. So we found that on this, our average weight was 70.81 grains. That's actually acceptable. So that means that in this particular instance, if you were to just weigh 70 grains by volume, that other than the fact that the charges become inconsistent because of the way that you're measuring it, you would be in the ballpark, that your average weight would be about perfect. So you could take and set your powder your scale, digital scale, to 70 grains and pour 70 grains of powder on there and you're good to go. Okay? We're going to talk about that in a second. Now we found on the 3F, it actually threw light. 66.94 average grain weight for a 70 grain average or volume, okay? That's a little bit further off the grade. So again, German 1F, and then for fun, we went ahead and did Swiss 4F, 70 grains of volume. The Swiss 4F powder, which you would never throw 70 grains of 4F powder, but it threw at 71.1, so very close to the intended weight. The German 1F threw at 71.28. So what are we seeing here? What is the pattern that we've developed in this data? Is that all the real black powder is pretty dang close. The substitutes seem to be about the furthest off, in particular the Jim Shockey. So, all right, why does any of this matter? Okay, so because if you threw 70 grains of volume out of this measure, we've quite clearly proven that you're in most cases, if not all the cases except for the Shockeys, you're getting over 70 grains of powder in actual weight. So why does this matter? Two reasons. One, you want to weigh the powder, each charge, just like you would for match grade smokeless rifle ammo. Okay, if you weigh out the exact charge, guess what? You're getting the exact charge, so it's going to be a lot more consistent. So by weighing your charges and trickling your charges, you're going to get much better consistency, as why wouldn't you want the consistency? If your smokeless powder measure was throwing at such a large deviation that this measure is, you certainly would want to remedy that if you were looking for the best accuracy in your smokeless powder hand loads. What's the second reason? Well, the second reason is because, I lost my train of thought. The other reason is because in order to get the power threshold to get very, very, very much higher in black powder, the thresholds aren't exactly the same as smokeless powder. So that extra 2 grains, that extra 1 grain, like here we got an extra grain of powder, here we have 4 grains less than what the intended amount is. That amount of deviation is not going to be terribly enough to really affect the power level of the cartridge anyway. The pressure curves on black powder are very much different. And also the amount of powder that you have to really add, once you reach a certain power threshold on black powder, you have to have a ton more black powder to really cross that threshold and get a lot of extra power out of the cartridge. So let's say that you look at the old cartridges like 4570. Okay, you look at 4570 government, 45 caliber bullet on 70 grains of powder. Well, what did they wind up finding out later? They're like, oh, well, let's do a 4590. Let's do a 45-100. Let's do a 45-110. Well, what were they doing? All they were doing was just making the cartridge longer and longer and longer so they could accommodate more powder in the cartridge to get perceivably more velocity. And absolutely, you're going to get more velocity the more powder you get behind that cartridge. But what they found out later is you started getting into like the 577 express rifles, like the big game rifles, and you have the black powder express, which is basically a 577 Snyder, but with just a lot more powder. Something at the tune of like, I want to say 120, 130 grains of powder, whereby, you know, that's almost double the powder that's in a standard service rifle in a Snyder or a P53 infield. But they found, I mean, yeah, you got some extra velocity. Absolutely, you're doubling the powder, you're going to get more velocity. But what they found is that there was a threshold on the amount of powder that you could physically get in the case to where your velocity gains just really wouldn't be that much, okay? You're going to get some extra velocity, mostly a bunch of extra dang recoil is what you're going to get. Is it going to hurt the gun? Probably not. Is it going to bruise your shoulder more? Probably so. You're going to get more recoil. Are the velocity gains going to really be worth trying to cram the extra powder in there? Probably not. You're going to get more fouling because you got more volume of powder that's being burned. Black powder burns quite inefficiently and it leaves a lot of dang residue behind. So they found that in a lot of these large cases that they were getting a lot of fouling issues with the bigger charges of black powder. Okay, that's why we want to talk about this, because it's important. All right, so how do you measure, so to answer the question that we posed at the beginning of this video, how do you measure black powder, by volume or by weight? The answer is both. You do both. All right, so the procedure would be, all right, my charge calls for 70 grains of powder. Okay, that's what the manual says. I look in a manual, or I look in my favorite load book, and my 4570 calls for 70 grains of, let's say 2F black powder, whatever, okay? But let's say that I've got a new brand of 2F I've never used before. All right, I've never used this powder, I want to try this powder. Well, then what I would do is I would take whatever volumetric measure I plan to use, and this data has to be collected for every volumetric item that you plan to use, because okay, if I order 5 different Chinese powder measures, all these things are made in China, which is fine. This one's actually made in Taiwan. But if you have all these different measures made in all these different places, is there some standard for what they agree 70 grains of volume on this little thing is supposed to throw? It's going to be close, but is it going to be the same for every measure? No. So what you do is you take whatever measure you're going to use, and you weigh out 10 charges by volume, and you find the average. And whatever that average is, then if you decide to do it, you can go ahead and weigh on a scale that average. And that is your charge weight. But you have to perform that volumetric test to find out what that volume actually is, what it actually weighs. Okay? It's no different than if you're running RCBS Little Dandy to throw small pistol charges, or if you were using a standard type of measure to throw smokeless powder. You would still weigh it, right? You don't just go, well, that looks like it fills up the case about right. The volume looks about right, so let's just cram a bullet on it and go. No, you weigh it. So it's exactly the same thing. Black powder is sold by weight, it's measured by weight, but you do want to confirm the volume. Now, what would be another reason that you'd want to confirm the volume on black powder? Because the position of black powder in a cartridge and the way it's loaded in the gun is sensitive to how the gun can safely be discharged as well. Okay? And let's say that, for instance, a charge called for a certain amount and you poured it down the case, and for whatever reason, the physical volume of that powder was a little bit lower than what it needed to be. And let's say you loaded the powder in the case and you didn't think about it and you just crammed a bullet and you had like an air pocket. No good. You do not want an air pocket or air gap, any type of gap. You want the wad, cushion, lubricating materials, patch, whatever, projectile needs to take up all the space in the cartridge above the powder. So that is why this volume thing gets thrown around so much, because the volume as it sits in a cartridge or as it sits in the rifle is directly correlated to the ability of that cartridge to be safely loaded. So as long as the volume of the powder you intend to use, you confirm it and you weigh it out and it fills the cartridge up, you're good, okay? That's pretty much this idea in a nutshell. We will talk about measures a little bit. So this is the measure I used to perform the test. This test would have to be conducted for these appropriate powders with every single different powder measure that you intend to use. So that means that, all right, this is what I used because it was convenient. But say I wanted to find out what this thing did. The data that I would collect from this powder measure, this is a Lyman black powder measure, which you actually do have a specific black powder measure. You cannot use a standard powder measure to measure black powder. You have to use a special one. So this one doesn't produce any static or any friction that can cause the powder to detonate. That'd be a very bad thing, because this thing holds like over a pound of powder. So you don't want a pound of black powder going off in your face. This measure might produce a different result, okay? So if I were planning to weigh my charges out on this and have this thing drop them a little bit light, okay, and then have this particular measure and have a trickler and then be able to weigh them out on my digital scale exactly, then that's what I'd have to do. So the exact amounts that we have were weighed using the RCBS Charge Master that we have here. So just to give you an idea. So the short answer is volume and weight. The two do go hand in hand a bit. But don't make it into this whole snake oil thing. Don't make it into this whole, don't buy into all the bull crap that people talk about, volume this, volume that, weight this, weigh that. It's a pound of powder, guys. There's so many charges you're going to be able to get out of a pound of powder. Okay, and that's just the bottom line. It is a pound of powder. It's not a volume of powder. It doesn't say, well, we don't know how much is in here. It's just however much fills up this bottle. No, it's a freaking pound. I don't know why people make such a to-do over this thing when the answer is pretty clear. It is measured by weight, guys. I mean, that's just the bottom line. But ensure that the volume you're dealing with for that weight is consistent. Make sure it yields the velocities you want, and make sure it fills the case up all the way and gives you the internal volume, especially in a cartridge-contained gun. Make sure that gives you the volume that's going to allow you to safely seat the bullet and not have any kind of gap or weird issue going on. In a standard black powder case, there's a few exceptions, of course, you're not really going to be able to put enough powder in a cartridge gun to really harm the gun that much, okay? It's not going to hurt the gun. If you took a 45-70, I don't care who you are, you're not going to get enough powder in a 45-70 case to harm the gun. Even if you were to fill it up all the way and then just scrape it off and then crush a bullet down on top of it, you're still not going to hurt the gun. And that's just the bottom line. So there's a lot of misinformation, and I hope this cleared it up for some of you. I've been loading black powder like this for probably about 20 years, and I've never had a single problem. So take my advice. I mean, this is just my observation. It's just something I want to make sure people realize that, you know, that is what you're dealing with volume versus weight, that there is some correlation between the two, but don't buy into it too hard. Just let the velocity be your guide, let the chronograph be your guide, and let the power factor and what it fills up in the case be your guide, and don't sweat it too much. Just get out there and have fun. That's the biggest thing. So guys, thanks for watching today's video. We really appreciate it. We hope you learned something. I know this video is kind of long, and we go into a lot of different things here, but I wanted to make this video as a service to the internet community. Hopefully, if you don't know about black powder, this can be sort of something that'll give you a bit of a primer so that you understand what you're dealing with. We don't want anybody getting hurt. We don't want anybody doing anything unsafe, and we don't want anybody spreading any type of misinformation or falsehoods related to measuring black powder. So hopefully this clears it up. Guys, thank you so much for the support. We appreciate all of our Patreon supporters, those of you that purchase man cans. You guys are awesome. You allow us to continue doing what we're doing. So if you enjoy this content and you learn something, consider donating $1 or $2 on Patreon, or consider purchasing a man can to help support our efforts. Thank you guys so much for watching. Many more videos on the way. We'll see you next time.